Yes, thank you very much, Laura. And can I add my welcome as well? So as Laura said, my name's Ian Ashman and I'm one of the board members of CPRE. So I'm the secretary, volunteer and responsible for our meetings and particularly policies. My background is that I was a college principal, further education college. So I have some experience of both health and safety and safeguarding from the point of view of an organisation. I'm not an expert in either, but I do have experience, and that's what we want to share with you today. And as we've said on this screen, I'm going to talk a little bit about giving you an introduction to health and safety, risk assessment and safeguarding from a theoretical point of view, legal point of view, and then Laura is going to talk from a practical point of view, given her experience as someone involved in parks. And then we really want to hear from you. So people who've had a look at this, we'd really like to hear from you, share your experience. And as Laura said, we'll want to run a Q&A so that we can do our best to answer questions. There are some web links in the presentation and Laura will post the presentation afterwards so you can click on those. But I'll point to those resources as we go along. So next slide, please, Laura. So this is just a bit of a health warning. As I said, I'm experienced as a practitioner, but I'm not an expert in either health and safety or in safeguarding. So what we're doing is sharing our policies, our practice. We've got a handout as well, which we'll share. So these are things that we use in CPRE. We believe they're compliant with what's required, but we can't make any promises on that. So it's important that you have a look at these things. We know from feedback that Laura gets that people are increasingly being asked to share policies by local authorities, by insurers, by funders and so on. So I think that's one of the things that's driven the need for this meeting. So we're not offering prescriptions here. We're not saying this is how you should do it. You need to develop your own approaches, but we hope you'll take this as being useful and practical information. Next slide. So I'm going to start with health and safety and risk assessment. Next slide. So the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 is often thought about as relating to employers, but it does apply to charities. It places duties on employers, but it extends those duties to other people, including volunteers and the public. So in effect, although the Act doesn't apply to unregistered voluntary organisations, if you are a registered charity, you will have obligations, and any member of the public, you and I, do have a duty of care to look after each other. And that is enshrined in the Health and Safety at Work Act. So if you see something dangerous or you have practices you're concerned about, you do have a duty to make sure you're acting on that. So all organisations, whether you're a registered charity or voluntary organisation or an informal group, do have some responsibilities to ensure safe practices. And what that's about particularly is identifying hazards, recognising hazards, and then doing some risk assessment to control and minimise the risks. And as mentioned, having health and safety and safeguarding policies are useful because increasingly people are asking to see those. So next slide, please, Laura. So the sort of common mantra, the bon mot, is hope for the best and plan for the worst. And so this is about, planning for what potentially could go wrong. And the Health and Safety Executive have got some great resources, which I'll point to in a bit. But one of the things that they say in their guidance is that not only is preparation helpful, but actually simply considering risks and ways to reduce them is proven to make a difference to the amount of accidents that there are. and particularly if you can identify risks and take action to reduce it. You can't eliminate all risks, but you can try and minimize those, and in some cases you can avoid risks altogether by thinking about whether something dangerous is actually necessary. And this is not a one-off exercise. This is something you need to think about over time when practices change. If you introduce some new way of working, if you're getting involved in a project, for example, that involves tools for the first time, or taking on some work that might have greater hazard, then it needs to be something you repeat. So that thought about not becoming complacent, keeping things under review, is an important part of risk assessment. So that's a bit of the background. And this is about considering the risks and ways of reducing them through undertaking risk assessments. Next slide. Thanks, Laura. So thinking about hazards, by hazards, what's meant is what might go wrong, who might be harmed, how they might be harmed, evaluating risks, thinking about the precautions you've got are adequate or whether more could be done. And then a really important part of that is getting it written up and shared, so that you've got something that documents the kind of things that could go wrong. You've got a method statement that sets out how you think they should be done. So sharing that with your volunteers, particularly anybody who you're giving a leadership role, giving them a task or a group of people to supervise. And then, as I've said, reviewing those assessments from time to time. Next slide, please. So when you're thinking about risk assessment, and this applies to safeguarding as well, it's important. You can't consider everything, but you can think about main risk areas. And one of the things that the Health and Safety Executive highlight is that half of accidents fall into three categories, half of accidents at work. So those are slips, trips and falls. So people tripping over things, people falling down things, lifting and handling. So particularly risk of things like back injury from lifting heavy objects, or moving things around in awkward ways, objects and tools. And then the third one is people being struck by objects. So the classic cartoon comedy of somebody swinging around with a ladder or standing on a hoe and springs up in the face. You can think of all those Wile E. Coyote cartoons, if you like, to think about principal risks. Those slip, trips and falls, lifting and handling, being struck seem to come up in all of those cartoons quite often. So thinking about those, and then things which are maybe less frequently but might have more serious consequences. So they're things like machinery, vehicles, and safeguarding and welfare. So less likely to happen, but if they do happen, they could have more serious consequences. So this is really about you thinking about the activities that you're doing yourselves and with your volunteers, and just thinking through each stage of it and what risks might occur, and then what can you do about them. Next slide, please. So this is a template. I'll read through it just in case you can't see it. But this template is one that comes from the Health and Safety Executive, and there's a link on the page that takes you to a very short guidance document on risk assessment, and it includes this template here. So the template asks you to note who carried out the assessment, when they did it, and when they might do the next assessment. And the column headings take you through a risk assessment and mitigation process. So first of all, complete the first column. What are the hazards? Thinking through the different stages of an activity. So this might be an activity that you've got organised around maintaining or improving your park, or it might be an event, for example. So identify the hazards first of all. Then document who might be at risk, who might be harmed and how from each of those hazards. Note then what you're already doing to control the risks. So you'll already probably have put in place some mitigation, for example, about control of hazardous substances that you might be using, or having somebody to take responsibility for tools, getting things signed in and out, that sort of thing. Any further action that you could identify which might help control the risks, and then documenting who would carry out the action and when it needs to be done. And then finally a tick. So you can issue this form to people either electronically or on paper, and everybody who's involved can see that checklist. So essentially it's about spotting the hazards, thinking about who might be harmed and why, noting what you're already doing, thinking about what further you could do, who would do that, and when would it need to be done. So that's the risk assessment process. And it's a fairly straightforward process, and particularly it's something that the more you do, the easier you will find it to do. Right. So on to the next slide, please, Laura. So I'm going to move on to safeguarding, but some of the principles of risk assessment certainly apply here as well. Next slide. So what is safeguarding? As many of you will know, the practice of safeguarding is something that arose from a number of very significant incidents involving death to young people. The Soham murders and the Victoria Climbié case were very much in the minds of legislators when safeguarding was developed. But it was not a new concept. It was something which organisations working with young people and vulnerable adults have been doing for a long time. But it is much better documented now. Okay, somebody's got a microphone on. If they can turn it off, please.
Off, but we still make decisions like, you know, in her 30s, she might have.
I'll just see if I can mute.
Thank you.
I mean, you know, that's people who come to me off.
Let's see. Oh,
okay, thank you.
Sure.
So that's what safeguarding is. It's about promoting the welfare of children and vulnerable adults and protecting them. And just to be clear, children are those who are aged 18 years and younger. Vulnerable adults are people who have a mental or physical impairment which might put them at greater risk of harm. So all organisations that work with children and vulnerable adults have a responsibility to safeguard them from harm and promote welfare. So whatever type of organisation you are, whether you're registered or unregistered, if you're working with children or vulnerable adults, or you may come into the contact with them, you do have a responsibility. And without going into the details, which you can find in the guidance, types of harm essentially include abuse and exploitation. So abuse could be physical, emotional, sexual, it could be neglect. Exploitation could be, for example, taking advantage of young people or vulnerable adults to exploit them and make them do things that they might not want to, or make them take risks for others. So there've been a number of examples recently, for example, of something called cuckooing, where people have placed vulnerable adults in situations where they're responsible for cannabis farms. So that's the exploitation side of it. Now, there is a lot of guidance out there for voluntary organisations. I've highlighted a link there for charities on the gov.uk website. If you're a member of NCVO, you have access to a variety of resources, and most local authorities will also have resources, and then that includes access to guidance and training in many cases. Next slide. Thanks, Laura. So what are the things that you can do in practice? So one of the things that both Laura and I would mention is proportionality. So you need to think about the level of risk that applies to your organisation, and this applies to health and safety as well. You can get a bit intimidated by these legal responsibilities, and you need to take them seriously. But an organisation with a lot of professionals doing social work or taking care of children and vulnerable adults will need to have a full raft of policies and procedures in place. For us, we have some pretty simple policies and guidelines that we think are proportionate to the level of risk that we have in CPRE. In general, we're not working with children or vulnerable adults, and certainly not with children who are unsupervised. So important to develop a proportionate policy and some practice documents that can help you. And then to design and undertake your programs and activities in a way that protects vulnerable people from harm that may arise from your activities. So thinking about, when you're doing those risk assessment forms, having safeguarding risks as one of the categories for a risk assessment. For example, if you're doing an event, when you're thinking about the hazards and risks, one of the risks might be of children becoming unsupervised, parents or guardians wandering off, for example. You also will need to consider safeguarding risks when you're recruiting, managing and deploying staff and volunteers. And in particular, if you're an organisation that does target children or vulnerable adults in the services that you offer, then you may need to get involved in the vetting and barring procedures. That's not something you'll need to do if you're not targeting and if you don't employ staff. If you do employ staff and you're targeting these groups for your services, hopefully you already know about this and you're doing it. But if you're thinking about going into that, that's something to consider, and you would need to register with the vetting and barring service and put people through those safeguarding checks. And then on top of that, you would, in your practices, you should document some clear procedures to handle incidents or allegations. And this is a handout which we can share with you afterwards. We've got a simple document on a side of A4 with a few very simple steps. And I'll talk a little more about those in a moment. Next slide, please, Laura. So it's important that all employees, trustees and volunteers are alert to potential indicators of neglect and abuse. That when you're doing that hazard spotting, alert to the fact that there are risks from abusers or potential abusers. Unfortunately, abusers do make a habit of targeting events or places where they think vulnerable adults or unsupervised children may be. And parks, unfortunately, are somewhere where you may well have a lot of children. So it can be a place where potential abusers may be. So it's important to be aware of that. And it's important that the person who's taking a lead on this is sharing information with people so that assessments can be done. And then once you're engaged in your practice, you need, and your volunteers need, to just think about how they're contributing to this work, and the risk assessment and policy hopefully gives you some guidance on that. Next slide, please. So what can you do in practice? So extending the scope of risk assessments to include safeguarding, having clear procedures to handle incidents, and then those procedures should be about how you would go about dealing with an incident should it arise or a disclosure. And essentially your duties would be to just make sure that you understand what's happened, talk to somebody if they're raising an issue or you have concerns. Important not to promise people confidentiality in those circumstances, because you can't. You may have to report what's happened. Taking action to stop any harm if you can see something happening that is a risky situation. And then reporting. So all local authorities have a system of duty social workers. You can find who they are. You can document the links and any telephone numbers in your procedure. Or if there's a serious risk or you need to take immediate action, then report that to the police using 999. And as I said, we will share our document so you can see it, and it gives you an example to think about. So those are some thoughts about the kind of things that you need to think about and what you can think about in practice. And we're going to move on just to think a bit more about practice. And Laura, we're going to take questions, I think, at the end rather than now. Is that right?
Yeah, we could take questions at the end. I'm sorry, I can't see the if people have their hands up because of the way that my screen it's laid out at the moment. But
okay.
Yeah, that sounds fine.
Okay, so there you go. 5 steps of things you can do practically. Identify a lead person. Can be a different person for health and safety and safeguarding. It could be that you already have people in your organization who, in terms of their work, could be teachers, for example, who'd be familiar with this, or people who are in the workplace, in something like construction where they might have experience of health and safety. If you can get people trained, then a short course in CVO, if you're a member of them, do a simple one-day training. Laura can talk a little about her experience of that. There are lots of companies out there that offer health and safety training, and there's some good online materials as well. Many local authorities offer free courses to voluntary organisations on safeguarding. So get somebody to take a lead on it, get them to draft a simple policy and procedure, get the information disseminated, and use the materials. And there's some links there. Okay, I'm going to hand on to Laura now.
Yeah, so in addition to my role with Grow Parks London and London Friends of Green Spaces Network, I also chair a friends group in Merton called Friends of Higgs Marsh. And there, for various reasons I'll get into in a minute, I'm also the designated safeguarding lead for our voluntary group. So I'm just going to talk through sort of how I've approached safeguarding in practice with our group. So first of all, just to emphasize again what Ian has said, we do have some resources on the Go Parks London resources page, and later I can put a link in the chat to that page. You can find a template on safeguarding and also risk assessments, and also disclosure forms, which it's a time saver and is a really helpful starting point for sort of how to think about approaching these issues, and sort of a starter tent to get, sort of trigger thoughts about what you might need to consider for your own group. I did the NCVO safeguarding training because I'm also the designated safeguarding lead for CPRE London, and one of the key takeaways from that training, was a full day course, was that these policies should be proportionate. So if you are dealing a lot with vulnerable adults or children who are unattended or unsupervised by their parent or guardian, then your policies must be much more robust and lengthy. Whereas I think many friends groups often, many of their activities do not include, for example, unsupervised children, in which case, you might not need quite the level of detail that a group, that dealt with, for example, unsupervised teenagers would perhaps need. But it's really important to think about your own activities. What do you engage in, and evaluate, your exposure to risk, essentially. So I guess one thing to say, though, is that while you may say, you're not deliberately targeting, or planning to hold activities for, say, vulnerable adults or unsupervised children, sometimes it can be harder to anticipate what will actually happen on the day of your event. Certainly, you can say to parents, well, we don't allow unsupervised children, and you can make that clear in your advertisements for your event. But it can be harder to know, for example, with vulnerable adults, what their background is, and therefore what your exposure to risk is. So it's just something to bear in mind, that it's a little bit, you can't 100% eliminate your exposure to safeguarding risks. So one thing that is helpful, I think, to consider for groups is that when you're thinking about a designated safeguarding lead, or someone who will be the key point for safeguarding concerns, and who will perhaps, have the do the training, or reading up on safeguarding. Many groups will probably already have someone who has a safeguarding background, perhaps for another organization that they volunteer with, or through their work. So, for example, in my group, it was logical for me to start with the safeguarding because I was already a school governor for a secondary school, so had done quite a lot of mandatory safeguarding training through that role. And therefore, I already felt quite familiar with safeguarding issues, policies, and risks. And there's likely to be someone that's associated with your group who maybe already has that background, and indeed may have already been required to get formal training for it as well. Sorry, I'm just going to admit this person. There we go. Oh, thank you. And then, as I said, the main takeaway from the NCVO training, which was great. It is expensive, though. I think it was around £240. So it's just something to bear in mind, because I know that a lot of groups, that would be a pretty high cost, particularly for smaller groups. Is that your policies should be proportionate. I think when I started out, I was quite worried, especially coming from a secondary school training background, where there's a lot of information to take in and a lot of risks to consider. And it was reassuring to hear them reiterate that, you do have to be careful, but it should all be proportionate. So that was just something to take away, and hopefully make people feel a little bit more confident when they're considering these issues. And also just to say that I think also a critical thing was to have a plan in place for, should something happen that required action. I also just wanted, sorry, just before we get on to Dave, I just wanted to add that, I think that in addition to requiring safeguarding policies, many local authorities are also requiring things like risk assessments that you will submit with, if you wanted to hold an event in your park. Many local authorities require an application to hold the event, and then they may require you as well to submit a risk assessment. So in our group, we normally, we're undertaking things like bulb planting and weeding and some shrubbery planting, kind of all of the same sort of activity. So we, our risk assessments were very much in the lines of, and no unsupervised children were very much along the lines of what Ian was talking about earlier, with the kind of comedy slapstick sort of things, like, you know, being hit with a shovel or stepping on a tool or something like this. And then recently we decided to hold some free movement classes in the park, so yoga and something called Latin Jam, which sounds really fun. And so that suddenly it meant that we were having to look at our risks in a totally different way, because, you know, there was things like, well, if people are all like lying down on their yoga mats doing poses and whatever, and like a dog comes over, and, you know, maybe people are frightened of dogs, or just, you know, to suddenly think, well, actually there's like, you know, a lot more, a few more aspects that were needed to be considered in terms of like what could happen. It was like an area of unfamiliarity to us. So one of the things that we did was we consulted with the class instructors to get their input on our risk assessments, to make sure that, you know, they agreed that we had also considered everything. So it's just something to bear in mind as well, is that you may not need to necessarily do these risk assessments on your own. You might be able to also get some input from other people that might be involved in those projects. So yes, I think that's, in a nutshell, that's how we've approached safeguarding and risk assessments in our group. I think, Dave, are you still on the call? Would you like to sort
Yep.
of like, give us a little overview on how you've approached it in Lordship Rec?
So travelling from Merton to Tottenham in North London. Yeah, basically, vast majority of friends groups are unregistered voluntary associations, voluntary bodies, but we obviously have a duty to our members and the public generally when we organise activities. I think a lot of it is about you know, common sense. I think all of us involved with friends groups are aware that we have to be, you know, sensible, and also create a culture of common sense amongst our activities, amongst our members, rather than a kind of gung-ho, anything goes. And I think risk assessments are very useful, because as has already been said, just thinking about things, you know, even if it's not a compulsory thing to do, it's a risk assessment. It's certainly very useful, because you think in advance of what the risks might be and how to cope with them. So yes, I think there is a little bit of a difference between kind of what you might call internal activities, collective activities by members together, and events where you've called on the public to join in, and then you have more responsibilities because you're going to get random people, you're welcoming random people to get involved. Just to say a little bit about the Friends of Lordship Rec. Well, we do have a suite of policies. Laura, I've sent you a link from the parkscommunity.org.uk website, which is a website set up by and for friends groups. And if you could just circulate that link in the chat.
Sure.
There's six policies. You don't have to link on it now, everybody, but that identifies 6 policies that are very useful to friends groups, which includes equality and diversity, environmental policy, financial management. So it's useful and sometimes compulsory if you're applying for certain grants to have a whole suite of policies. So those 6 there at that link are pretty useful and standard policies for a friends group to have if you're applying for grants, and well, just generally to be a functioning, sensible group. We took the view quite early on with the Friends of Lordship Rec that we would not take responsibility for unsupervised children. Children have to be with their parents. Yes, I mean, obviously, you know, there may be grey areas. Some child wanders into what you're doing without their parent. But that's, as a sort of standard policy, our policy is that we won't supervise children. They have to be with their parents in whatever we're doing, whether it's a public activity or whether it's a volunteering session or whatever. The other thing we've got in Friends of Lord Shipwreck is that we've got working groups. So we've got 5 different working groups for different volunteering activities. And each one of those working groups has a coordinator. So ultimately, the coordinator of that group is responsible for any activity or volunteering session that subgroup organises. I think that's basically all I've got to say, and I do agree that we want to encourage more friends groups to form, and more activities to be organised. So we don't want to put people off by scaring them that they've got to have before they start complex constitutions and bank accounts and suites of policies before they've even started finding their feet. So I do feel that there needs to be a common sense approach on the reality of that we're ordinary people who care about our local green space, but we do need to act responsibly. Okay, that's it. That's my contribution.
Thanks, Dave. I think I'm just going to check. I think the last slide was just to ask if people have any questions. Yes, they did. So I will, I think let's open it up to any questions that anyone might have or comments. Yes, Kelly.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much, Dave, for your comment about your policy is not to have unsupervised children. Can I just ask how you advertise that or how you share that in your activities? Do you say, if parents are there, please stay with your children? How do you manage that? Thank you.
Dave, you're on mute.
Yeah, I mean, we don't really advertise it when we don't really publicise our policies in advance. But if anybody comes along, then we make it clear that a child has to be with their parents, and the parents have to look after their children. So, yeah.
We do it. When we publicize our events, so whether it's to our email group or on Facebook or whatever, we tend to say, for example, this activity is suitable for children 5 and over or 12 and over, but then say children must be supervised by a parent or guardian. Yeah, so that's how we tend to address it. Then recently, for the movement classes that I mentioned, we have said we've asked for people to sign up for the classes by Eventbrite. So we've said in the Eventbrite, this activity is geared toward adults, no unsupervised children. Also, I think that just another way of if you wanted to do an activity that was kind of geared toward children, we did a sort of junior Friends of Figs Marsh type of thing. I think it might have been pre-COVID actually, but we did it through other local groups. So we had guides come, so they were supervised by guides and we led the activity, but the guides leader was there. Similarly with Scouts, I think we've done things with the local school as well. So you can do kind of large group activities with kids, but they're supervised by someone. So that's a good way of doing that. Any other questions? Sue.
Yes, just sorry. Just setting up one in Fairfield in Kingston. Obviously, we decided not to work with, or membership will be 18 years and over. Not knowing, I've done expressions of interest, got about 100 people replied back, not knowing who or what might be vulnerable. In relation to having a safeguarding policy, should we just adapt one that's generalistic, or would that need to be focused on vulnerability? And would we also need to include a statement about child safeguarding?
Ian, do you want to say something and then I can chip in after?
Yeah, I think it would be, I think you could well use some of the resources that are on the screen here, but yes, it would be sensible for you to have a policy that's specific and considers this issue clearly, and the practical suggestion that both Dave and Laura mentioned about taking an approach based on not having unsupervised children is a sensible part of it. Laura?
Yeah, I think the safeguarding policy that, or template that we have on the Go Parks London website, which I think you can get a link to it in the link for Go Parks London that I put in the chat, it's what we used for Friends of Figs Marsh as a starting point. I adapted it. I mean, obviously take out references to CPRE London, put your own name in, but more than that, it was yeah, I mean, there were things that I took out and then probably things that I added. I did it a while ago, so I can't remember exactly, but I did definitely edit it. I think, you know, things about children, if you're not having unsupervised children, if your membership is 18 and over, then you know, I think you can be pretty minimal in that regard, but you're in a park, so there will be children around, so it's kind of, you can't eliminate sort of your exposure to children completely. And then, yeah, with regards to the vulnerable adults, I think, you know, you can't know, you know, sort of without interviewing people extensively, you can't know their background and what they've been exposed to in the past and what their, you know, where they're kind of coming from, and therefore what their risks are and whether they would be a vulnerable adult. I think it's just not always obvious. And also, you know, it's good to be inclusive and to let everyone, you know, who is capable join in with your activities. So I think, you know, focusing a bit on vulnerable adults is quite a good idea, but obviously with the caveat that unless you're specifically targeting vulnerable adults, it would not need to be, you know, as comprehensive as maybe something that, you know, adult social care would have to provide. Yeah, that's, Ian, would you agree with that?
I would, yes.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Can I say something, risk assessments as well?
Yeah.
But you know, if you haven't done one before, yeah, it does seem like quite a big, complicated thing. But actually, they're not that complicated. But also, once you've done one, say for example, we've got 5 different working groups in the Friends of Lord Chiltern who work in different activities or parts of the park. And you know, once they've done one risk assessment, it applies generally to all those sessions that group will organise during that year, pretty much the same. And you know, once you've done one, say you organise an annual major event and you've done a risk assessment for that, then the following year, you know, you dust it down and just tweak it if it needs tweaking. So I think risk assessments are really useful. But the other thing also is that when you have a session, volunteering session, you should brief people at the beginning of that session, you know, health and safety particularly. So just run through the basics about how to look after tools and not leave them lying around and stuff like that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Don't swing the spades around. Look at, yeah, be careful, that kind of thing. Thank you, Dave. Okay, Hannah.
Hi everyone. So I run a community garden and also a friends group, and we have things like on a Sunday we have a family sort of drop-in gardening session, and on a Tuesday we have a forest toddlers. So I've got 2 sort of questions. One is that we have a policy in place, is that I find risk assessments tricky when you're being spontaneous with small people. You know, so you can plan to do something and then all of a sudden you get the nails out and they want to do a bird table, and you know, you're trying to follow the flow of play, And then what happens for me is then the parks department say to me, yeah, but you had a risk assessment for watering and bulbs on that day, and we saw you had nails out. So I'm trying to sort of develop something that's a sort of a generic sort of risk assessment tick. And then they said they would be fine with a box that said, and these things happened and I mitigated these risks, you know, like a sort of a one on the go. Like, how do you risk assess on the go when your plans change? I guess that's my question.
I think the clearly part of the risk assessment process is thinking about what might happen, and not necessarily everything that you've got planned. There can be additional things. I think the other thing is that risk assessment is a process that you learn, and just thinking through that, you know, what's the hazard here? What can we do to mitigate it? Those steps that are outlined in the column headings become a way of working. And so, yes, that generic box of managing risks as they emerge, you know, you can be saying that actually whatever risk emerges, we have staff who think about the following.
Yeah.
What's the hazard? What could we do to mitigate it?
That makes sense. Are there any versions of kind of risk assessments that have sort of been pre-made like that, where you can just sort of, do you know what I mean? Sort of a templatey sort of.
Yeah, so I guess you probably want one for a group that works with like toddlers and young children. Yeah, I can try to find one for you.
That would be amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, that does sound like, I mean, first of all, the work that you're doing sounds really interesting, and I quite like to catch up with you separately on that another time to find out more, because I think that yeah, letting the kids sort of like navigate their way through the activities, and you know, I think that sounds really lovely. It sounds like a fun group. I think that also, like, just to add to what Ian was saying, yeah, I think it's just got to be about best efforts. Like, you know, we're not perfect, and you know, as you say, you're working with children, like particularly young children. They have wild imaginations, and that's really fun. And I think part of being in nature should be about allowing them to explore their creativity, and you know, having fun outdoors and getting muddy and all that kind of thing. So I think yeah, just I think best efforts, and then as Ian said as well, just you know, learning from it, if perhaps that means like updating the risk assessment in the future to reflect what you know, sort of new areas they're going into, or yeah, what new risks that they might be exposed to. But yes, let me put word around a few groups and see if I can find something.
Races, isn't it? It's like, you know, all of these things are planned, but then actually then this happened, and this is how I mitigated the risk, you know.
Yeah.
My other quick question was, so we have no company children, but I have some really lovely kind of teenagers in the area, who one in particular is quite shy, and her dad walks her down to the garden, and we kind of give her a task, and then he comes and picks her up afterwards. It's one of those sort of things that has just slipped in and happened. But do other people have examples of that, or things that I should be thinking about?
So is this, she's just there on her own? It's not a formal activity that you're organizing. She's just, you know, doing her own thing.
So there'll be drop-in gardening happening, which has got a list of like tasks, and it's say we're clearing a bed, and you know, we'll give a talk about the tools. Her dad brings her and stays at the beginning, and then we say, this is what we're doing today, would you like to join in? And she says yes or no, and then her dad says, I'll come and pick you up a bit later. So it's kind of like, it's supported, and I have the conversation with the parent at the beginning and the end of the day, but she is, yeah. Is that risky?
I would there are some risks in that. I think I would say you manage that risk through a trusted person that's part of your team giving her supervision.
Yes, yeah.
She's not unsupervised, that you know, you're not placing her at risk that somebody from outside, you know, who was targeting a child could do so. Sorry, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I think we want teenagers, you know, to get involved, and you know, some of them, you know, the difference between a child and an adult is kind of a bit artificial. You know, there's a legal definition, but you know, so I think that yes, you'd have to be aware of that person and their needs and look out for them, I think, yes.
Great. Hannah, just to say really quickly, I will try to get that risk assessment for you as soon as possible, but I'm away for a bit, so it just give me a little bit of time, and I will try to get something for you as soon as I can.
No rush. I'll meet you all.
Thanks. I think Nia had her hand up, but it looks like it's gone down, so I don't know if you still have a question, Nia.
Hi, my computer's a bit laggy, so I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. No, I was only going to add on to the previous person because I've been recently in a same position with the teenagers. And now that the council, Enfield Council, have stopped offering insurance and we've just got our own, unfortunately, our insurance won't cover that either. So now we have had to put a policy in that we can't have anybody under 18 by themselves. So I was just going to mention that, depending on what your insurance will cover.
I guess it's sort of, that's a really good point. It's worth looking at your policy. I guess it's kind of a sort of a tricky area as well, because you have the relationship with the father. So, you know, you've had that conversation and he's, you know, in a way, I think it's kind of it's a tricky one. But yeah, that's a really good point, Nia. Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? I'm just gonna scan through the screens because I don't see everyone at the same time. So I just want to make sure I can't see anyone waving their hands saying, please help. Okay, well, I think if there's no other burning questions, then we can leave it there. Obviously, any other questions that come up afterwards, please drop me an email. Hopefully you've all got my email because I sent out the reminder this morning. I will try to get the recording and links out in an email tomorrow before I go on leave. And I just want to say thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Great questions, and thanks all for your input and contributions. Thank you very much, Ian, for you know, all of your knowledge and sharing that with us today. Really much appreciated. And also thank you, Dave, for your practical tips on how it works at Lord Shipwreck, and also for the links that you shared as well, which I will include in the email. So yes, thank you so much, everyone, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.